Welcome back, Oblivion fans. Today's video is going to feature a deep dive on Alchemy in Oblivion Remastered. Starting from the very basics of how you create your first potion or poison, we're going to talk about tips for fast alchemy level progression and a few useful combat potions that will come in super handy, especially on master difficulty. The last part of the video will do a deep dive on how you can use alchemy and destruction magic to do billions of damage in seconds. Obviously, you don't need to do billions of damage in any difficulty, but the discussion there is more to show you how you can stack enemy weaknesses quickly, how the numbers work, and how you can put all of this together to finish off enemies quickly, even on master difficulty. So if you're already comfortable with the basics of alchemy and you're more interested in how you can stack the weaknesses, skip ahead a few chapters. But for now, let's start with the basics. So the first opportunity to use poison in the game happens early on at the cave with the goblins in the tutorial section. This poison damage comes in especially useful on master difficulty because without the poison, chances are that the first goblin you see will probably kick your ass if you try to take him on without any poison. Trying what works on adept difficulty will barely move the needle on his health bar. Flare damage, sneak attack plus flare attack will barely move the health bar on this guy. Now if you use the poison sitting on the table beside him on your bow or whatever weapon you're using, he's going to go down in one shot. And this is where you can see one of the best things about alchemy right off the bat if you're playing on master difficulty. The damage you do from these poisons is not reduced even on master difficulty. This is one of the things that, in my opinion, makes alchemy probably the best skill in the whole game. Now, in order to access the alchemy menu, you're going to need a mortar and pestle, and you will find one on that very same table where you found the poison to kill that first goblin. Once you have the mortar and pestle in your inventory, you simply need to click on it to bring up the alchemy menu, and it'll show you a list of ingredients from your inventory that could be used to create poisons or potions. You're going to need at least 2 ingredients with a common known effect in order to be able to make your first potion or poison. And this is where the filter function in the alchemy menu comes in super handy, as it's going to let you search for specific effects and narrow your list of items, which can get pretty long as you explore and start to pick up a bunch of stuff. Now at this stage in the game, since I don't have a lot of ingredients, if I'm just starting out, I'm not going to see too many effect options. Now if I picked up the wisp stock caps and the stinkhorn caps on this cave, I'm going to see that I can make 4 damage health poisons, which are going to help me get out of this goblin cave easier. As you continue to level up alchemy, more of these effects will become known until eventually you can see all 4 effects at alchemy level 75, which is going to open even more possibilities to make a lot more potions and poisons. So something like shock damage won't be something you can produce early on, because shock damage as an effect is typically found as the 3rd effect on certain ingredients, which you can only start to see at alchemy level 50. At alchemy level 100, you'll be able to produce potions or poisons from a single ingredient, and you're always going to produce 2, which is awesome. It's going to save you a ton of time farming ingredients and give you a lot of potions and poisons that you can sell for gold. So given that better potions or poisons will be available to you the sooner you level up alchemy, then I think it makes perfect sense to have alchemy be one of your major skills, so you can level it up quicker and get those better potions and poisons earlier in the game. Now let's talk about how you can make your poisons and potions even stronger with the right alchemy equipment. As I mentioned earlier, the mortar and pestle is the minimum base tool that you're going to need to be able to create a poison or a potion. There's 3 other tools, which we'll talk about now, and the usefulness of these tools will really depend on whether you're trying to create a poison or a potion. But before we look at those tools, I just wanted to clarify one thing that's important here. When you combine ingredients that produce at least 1 positive effect, that concoction is always going to be a potion, and it's going to have negative side effects if there's negative effects. So that means if you're trying to specifically create a poison, you're going to need a combination of ingredients that only produce negative effects. And so in terms of how these other 3 apparatuses come in, for a poison creation, the only other alchemy equipment that you would really benefit from having is the Calcinator, because the Calcinator is going to increase the strength of all effects, both positive and negative. So to illustrate this with a poison example, if I create a fire damage poison, and let's say I'm alchemy level 100 and I have a master mortar and pestle. So if I try to create that fire poison, the poison will be 5 points over 21 seconds. But if I mix that in and I have a master calcinator in my inventory, it's going to be 9 points over 37 seconds, so almost twice as much damage. The third piece, called a retort, is something that's going to boost positive effects in potions. So since it's focused specifically on positive effects, it's not going to have any impact on your poisons. And then the last thing, called the Alembic, will help you reduce negative side effects in potions if there is one. So depending on the ingredients you combine, you could have a situation where you create a potion with 3 positive effects like fortify health, speed, or whatever. But then maybe you have one negative side effect like drain health, which is going to drain your health. So the Alembic is going to help you reduce the potency and duration of that negative side effect, or negative side effects if you have more than one. But in any case, as you level up your character, you're going to start finding higher level equipment at alchemy shops or as random loot in certain dungeons. The only exception here is master level equipment, which you're only going to be able to find as random loot when your character hits level 17. The other thing to note about the table here is that you'll generally be able to find better equipment at lower levels in dungeons. NPCs will eventually carry up to expert quality, but you might be able to find those pieces of equipment a few levels early if you're lucky and you're trying to find it in the dungeons. The dungeons with the highest concentration of alchemy shops will typically be ones that have necromancers and conjurers, and some of the caves with the best probabilities for dropping alchemy equipment are the caves you visit near the tail end of the mage's questline. Echo Cave in particular has a number of boss level chests, which is going to increase your odds of finding this equipment. Now let's talk about how you can level alchemy quickly so you can access better effects for poisons and potions. Leveling up alchemy quickly early on in the game really comes down to finding potions or poisons that are super easy to make. Restore health and restore fatigue potions are amongst the easiest ones to make because there's a lot of ingredients that have those specific effects and they're pretty easy to find. There's a bunch of farms all around Cyrodiil that you can find, and you'll be able to find different crops in a lot of them that you can use for these types of potions. But I'm going to give you my top 5 on the map here. So the best farm, which I believe is pronounced Shedcombe, is located northeast of Kvatch. There's nothing shit about this place. It's got 66 carrot plants, 102 corn, 36 potato plants, and a bunch of other goodies that you'll be able to use to mass produce, restore health, and restore fatigue. This is a gold mine for leveling up alchemy and selling those potions for gold. Right around the corner from there is Shardrock Farm, which doesn't have quite as big of a selection but still has 74 corns and a couple of other things that you'll be able to use for those same potions. Farm number 3 is Odil Farm, which is quite close to Wynion Priory, where you have to go for the main quest. So once you pop in to say hello to Joffrey, you can ask this guy for a free horse, or you can simply walk on over to Odil Farm to get your hands on some more carrots and a few other types of crops. That leaves Lord Rad's estate, which is north of Anvil, and Harm's Folly, which is east of Imperial City. These won't have as many plants as the others, but they're still pretty good options to visit with decent amounts of carrots, corn, tomatoes, and other stuff. It's good to have different locations that you can hit up, and once you hit these farms once, you discard them out the map, it'll be pretty easy to keep going back to get additional ingredients later on. While not itself a farm, I also strongly recommend visiting the Wizard's Tower in the mountains close to Bruma early on. Even if you don't have any money to spend on the upgrades just yet, you're gonna be able to access the garden via one of the portals in the main room, and this is going to give you access to some rare ingredients that you'll be able to use for elemental damage poisons, paralyze effect, and a bunch of other sexier effects on the potions and poisons. Like with the farms, the crops in the garden will replenish, so you'll be able to come back here and keep farming them again in the future, especially as you make further upgrades to the Wizard's Tower. You might find yourself coming back here a lot to use the enchantment altars and the spell making altars once you have enough gold to purchase those. They're definitely must-haves, in my opinion. Now let's talk about combat poisons. There are a lot of strong poisons and potions that you can create at higher levels. There's poisons that can reach up to 5 or more different effects, but the trade-off there is that you might need to spend additional time to farm those very specific ingredient combinations. For that reason, I much prefer focusing on more basic potions and poisons and targeting specific effects based on my build. Simpler potions and poisons will generally be easier to make repeatedly without spending a ton of time farming them, so I'm going to focus on a few that I specifically like for combat situations and finishing off enemies quicker on Master difficulty. Early in game, damage health poisons will be really useful. They're easy to produce, even at lower levels, and they're even easier to produce if you pick Alchemy as a major skill and start with an Alchemy level over 25, as you're going to immediately know the first two effects of different ingredients, and there's going to be a wider list of ingredients where damage health is the first effect or second effect, as you can see on this chart. Below Alchemy level 25, your best bet is probably to farm Nightshade and Wisp Stocks caps. You're going to find high concentrations of Nightshade between Breville and Kvatch, with a fairly high concentration specifically being south of the White Rose River, south of Imperial City. And then for Wisp Stock caps, you can find about 80 of them at Fatback Cave. Fatback Cave is right around Imperial City, so pretty close distance to where you're going to be at the start of the game. And then in that same cave, you're also going to find a wide amount of Cairn Bullet caps, which you can use later on for shock damage effects. At Alchemy level 25, you can also start to use Sacred Lotus Seeds and St. John's Wort Nectar to produce damage health poisons. There's about 100 or so Sacred Lotus Seeds all around Imperial City. You can find them in the little pools that you see by the outskirts of each neighborhood. And then for St. John's Wort Nectar, you can find those very close to the outskirts of Coral. Another thing you can do at Alchemy level 25 is start to combine damage health with fire damage. The easiest path to doing that for me is Steel Blue Antiloma Cap, Flame Stalk, and a mix of whatever other ingredients on the list here you can get your hands on. You will find Steel Blue Antiloma Caps around Coral in that same area I mentioned earlier, and then you're going to find these all the way down to the Gold Road as well. For Flame Stalks, you're going to need to venture to the Shivering Isles and get yourself over to Dire Warren, where you'll be able to find over 60 samples, which will regrow over time. Dire Warren is pretty good as well for finding Wormhead caps, which you'll be able to use for paralyze poisons, so I definitely suggest visiting Dire Warren and the Shivering Isles early on. So if you've gathered Steel Blue Antiloma caps, Flame Stalks, and you've got some St. John's Wort Nectar and Wisp Stalks, you'll have enough to make a flame damage plus damage health poison. As you can see though, there's tons of other options in terms of what that third and fourth ingredient could be. So yeah, like don't necessarily stick to these, there's a ton of other options you can use. Once you get Alchemy up to level 75, you can easily layer in shock damage on top of fire damage and damage health by getting black tar from these green mushroom looking trees in the Shivering Isles. To get the 3 different magic effects, you can mix black tar with Steel Blue Antiloma, which we talked about earlier, Cairn Bullet Cap, and then you can use Imp Gall or Spittle Sticks as the 4th ingredient. The thing that might make Spittle Sticks the better option here is that imps, and by extension Imp Galls, will become harder to find at later levels. On the other hand, you're going to be able to find Spittle Sticks continuously from the garden at the Wizard's Tower, and you're going to find a bunch of these too in the Plains of Oblivion, with roughly 60 being available in the Kvatch Gate alone. Instead of using Cairn Bullet Cap as the 3rd ingredient, you could replace that with Fly Amanicha Cap, which is also available in very large quantities all around Imperial City. And then this switch will give you the same 3 effects plus burden on the poison. If you're farming Spittle Sticks in Kvatch, be sure to also farm Harda, which will come from these Whomping Willow-like trees that try to beat you up. And these will come in handy for paralysis effects, which is the other poison effect I wanted to quickly cover before we move on to damage stacking. Paralysis potions are great because they're going to buy you precious seconds to stun an enemy and either stack damage on them quickly or simply to even out the odds if you're outnumbered. Paralysis poisons will become a lot easier to produce after level 75, as you'll often see paralysis is the third or fourth effect in the more limited list of ingredients that can create it. The other ingredients that you should farm for paralysis is milk thistle seeds, which you can find around Kvatch, close to those farms I recommended visiting earlier. Worm head caps, which you can also find in Dire Warren and around the Shivering House. And then Haradas, which you can get from the garden in the Wizard's Tower, as well as Oblivion Gates. These can also be found in large quantities at Kvatch, so when you're farming for spittle sticks, you'll be able to farm a bunch of Haradas there as well during the same trip. You may want to hold off on producing these until you reach level 75. The reason for that is the moment you hit level 75 and become an expert in alchemy, then each time you produce a poison or a potion, you're going to produce a second one for free. So by finding ingredients to produce 60 of these, you're going to end up with 120 for the same amount of work. So now that we have our combat poisons, let's talk about damage stacking and how we can use these poisons to do billions of damage. To do this, we're going to need, obviously, alchemy, but we're also going to be needing to level up destruction. Alright, so let's start with a fire poison that does 9 points of damage per second, and an enemy that has no weaknesses or resistances, like a Khajiit. If I hit that enemy with a 100% weakness to fire spell, his weakness to fire will become 100%. Now instead of doing 9 points of damage per second, the fire poison will do 18 points per second, because the 100% weakness to fire will multiply my fire damage output by 2. Now if I hit him with a spell that has 100% weakness to poison as well as 100% weakness to fire, then I'm going to have a fire multiplier of 2 and a poison damage multiplier of 2, which will mean my 9 points of fire damage per second will now become 9 times 2 times 2, or 9 times 4, which will be 36 damage per second. So my two different weaknesses multiply together and then amplify my base damage by that amount. Now if you add weakness to magic at the end of that spell chain, each subsequent cast is now going to increase the weakness to poison and weakness to fire by an additional 100% per cast. The reason that you need weakness to magic here is that without it, you won't be able to scale weakness to poison and weakness to fire past 100%. In order to use weakness to magic spell, you're going to need your destruction level to be at least level 50, which is why I mentioned earlier that you're going to need this as well. Once you get weakness to magic in your spell, and you put that after your weakness to poison and weakness to fire, hitting him with the weakness spell 5 times will give him 500% weakness to fire and 500% weakness to poison. So that's going to make your attack multiplier now equal to 6 times 6, which is 36. So your new damage per second will be 36 times 9, which is 324 damage per second. So I set his health here to 1000, hit him with my dagger, and in about 3 or 4 seconds, he's dead. Now you could keep hitting him with that spell over and over again, and each subsequent hit would add 100% to the weakness stack. A higher destruction level will allow you to use higher durations while keeping the magic cost of these casts low, or lower than they otherwise would be. Alright, now watch what happens if I use a dagger with weakness to fire, weakness to poison, and weakness to magic enchantments to try and stack the weaknesses. Then I use the same dagger to try and apply the fire damage poison. The impact to his health will be the same as if I hadn't done any weakness stacking at all. His health was about 1k, and even though it seemed like I stacked 500% weaknesses across the board, my 6th dagger hit did the exact same amount of damage that I would have done without any stacking. So what this shows is that I can't use the same weapon to stack weakness effects and then use that same weapon to achieve the amplified poison damage that we saw in the first example. In other words, I could have stacked 1000% or 2000% with the dagger, but trying to use the same dagger to inflict the poison damage would have had the exact same damage output as not stacking the damage at all. So in order to benefit from that amplified damage, I would have had to put the poison on a different weapon. Now let's go back to that poison we made earlier, which also had shock and damage health effects. To increase the shock damage output the way I increase fire, I'm going to want to add in weakness to shock into the spell chain so I can further increase the shock damage portion of the poison. To increase damage health, I don't need to add anything else here because damage health will be amplified by both weakness to magic and weakness to poison, which we already have in our weakness stacking spells. Alright, so now let's set the weakness stacks by alternating between the spell and the dagger. We're going to do dagger, spell, dagger, spell, dagger, spell, and that's going to get us 3200% weaknesses, which I can confirm by looking at the console here. So simply by alternating between spell and the dagger to apply the weakness effects, you can see that the weakness percentages go up a lot quicker than they were when I was simply spamming one spell or one weapon. Instead of being at 600% weakness after 6 hits, the weakness stack went up about 5 times faster than that to 3200%. But as we saw earlier, there's a catch, and how you apply that damage poison matters. If you use the same dagger that you used to help scale up the weakness percentages that you see here, then your attack multipliers aren't going to be based on that full 3200%. Your damage multiplier might be limited to the portion of the weakness stack that is attributable to the spell over that 6-chain cast combo. Putting this another way, that 5th hit, which came from the dagger, put the total weakness stack at 1900%. So I know that the next hit from the spell will put the cumulative weakness stack attributable to the spell at 1900% plus 100, which means 2000% on the spell. So that means that my multiplier for each of the effects, if I put damage poison on that dagger, will be equal to 2000% divided by 100 plus 1, which simply equal to 21. So based on that multiplier of 21, fire damage and shock damage will each equal about 146,000, and then damage health will equal about 106,000, yielding a grand total of 400k damage. Now if, instead of hitting him with this dagger, we hit him with a different dagger or any other weapon that wasn't used for the weakness stacking at all, the multiplier is going to be based on that full cumulative weakness of 3200%. So that would make the multiplier of each effect equal to 33 and yield an attack value of over 1 million, which is about 3 times higher than the first one. So the key takeaway here, well actually there's two, is you can alternate between different spells or weapons to stack your weakness percentages quicker, but then to benefit from that full weakness stack percentage that you can achieve, you would need to apply your final hit with the damage poison from a different weapon. Alright, so given how deep into this I got, it was only natural that I was curious to see how much damage you can do on Master difficulty by stacking these weaknesses. So I gave our good friend the Khajiit Bandit here the maximum health value possible, which is 2.2 billion. I tried to put in 10 billion, but the game constrains us down to 2.2 billion, so that'll have to do. Alright, so to stack the weaknesses I followed the same combo 4 times. Spell, followed by 4 dagger hits. You can do this pretty quickly because the dagger moves fast, and I ensured that the last hit came from the spell. So that last spell inflicted a weakness stack of 217,300%, which gave me multipliers of 2174. The way the calculation works here, the total damage output I estimated to be 4.3 billion, and that was more than enough to comfortably drain his 2.2 billion health in about 20 seconds or so. Now if I do the exact same combo, but I deal the final blow with the damage poison using a different dagger, look at how much quicker that 2.2 billion health gets drained. It gets drained in like 5 seconds or so, which is crazy. So that's all fun and games, but let's talk about the trickier enemies where this might not be so simple. Inevitably, you're going to come across enemies that have high resistances to poison or full resistances to poison, which can render your attacks either less effective or flat out useless, unless you inflict some sort of weakness of what we did here. This can happen when fighting red guards, Argonians, undead characters. There's a bunch of them that have 100% resistance to poison. And it's really the stronger undead characters that I think can get pretty tricky. So let's take my favorite enemy in the whole game, the Leech. These start to come out around level 25 or so, and they can be super tricky because they just have a bunch of different things going on. Like with many other undead enemies, they have 100% resistance to poison. So if you try to hit them with the poison damage without any sort of weakness stacking, your poison multiplier will become 0, which will negate the whole poison damage effect, even if the Leech has 25% weakness to fire. Even better, they have 25% spell reflect and 25% spell absorption, which means 50% of your attempts to stack some sort of weakness will also be useless. And 25% of the time, the magic effect you try to throw their way might come back and hit you, which is absolutely lovely. So for an enemy like this, you're probably going to need to try a few different spells or shots to try to get those weaknesses to stack up. If you alternate a bow and a spell, you can try those at range, and then maybe have a second bow handy for the damage poison once you manage to get the weaknesses to stack up a little bit. And the resistance to magic may also render your initial weakness stacking attempts less effective, so it may just take a few extra shots or attempts to ramp that up, but nothing you can't handle. So yeah, that was definitely a big conversation on damage stacking, and just going back to more basic alchemy, I wanted to leave you with the alchemy calculator as well. As you've seen, there's a ton of possibilities in terms of the potions and poisons you can build, and the right fit for you will really come down to your build, difficulty you're playing in, and just general preferences of how I like to play the game. So this calculator will give you different ingredient options for specific effects that you might be seeking. You can tailor this based on your alchemy level, the equipment that you have, so that the recommendations that you see in terms of the ingredients is based on what you can actually achieve based on where your character is. You'll also get hyperlinks here to pages that have additional information on where you can find specific items. It's also going to rank the ingredients on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 indicating ingredients that are easier to obtain. So that's all super helpful as well, because it'll help you strategize your potion making a little bit better. So with that, I hope you found today's deep dive on alchemy useful. If you found the video helpful, please don't forget to like and subscribe, and stay tuned for my upcoming Viper Assassin build, which can be used to comfortably beat the game on Master difficulty. Stay tuned for that one, and ciao for now.